So a book that I have mentioned a number of times on this channel is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. It's an iconic collection of short horror stories for kids that is the source of many people's childhood trauma, myself included. There are 3 books in the series, and all of them contain some original stories, as well as some stories adapted from folklore and urban legends, so things like the Wendigo, the Alligator Man, the High Beam story, and the Man with the Hook Hand. But calling these books a series by Alvin Schwartz doesn't exactly paint the full picture, because along with Schwartz's stories, there are illustrations. Absolutely nightmarish illustrations that seemingly slipped by all of the elementary school librarians. These pictures, illustrated by Stephen Gamble, are honestly what makes the book so iconic, because the stories found inside can be a little eerie, but what makes them so unsettling is the art that accompanies them. Gamble is a genius at creating images that just feel cursed. Everything in his drawings is always like dripping or smoking. Nothing ever looks like it's settled into its place on the page. It makes all of his art feel alive, which is honestly pivotal for a horror story. While his depictions of ghosts and ghouls and corpses are really good, he also just knows how to draw some really gross looking humans. It gives you the sense that nothing in the world of scary stories is pleasant to look at. It's all weird and gross and eerie. Take a look at this drawing. Here we have what looks like a child crouching over some dirt with a hoe in his hands. Take a look at how his left hand seems to be dripping with something as well. Nothing in the story itself gives an indication that his hands are wet, but Gamble includes this detail anyways. The look on his face is also interesting. He looks slightly concerned, but again, this isn't telegraphed to us in the story. The boy's ear is also massive and looks like it doesn't fit on his head. All of this combines to just unsettle the reader. The last piece of this illustration is, of course, the toe. You see, in this story, the boy finds this toe in his garden, and then he and his family cook it into a stew and eat it. The concept of that is gross enough, but look at how gross the toe looks in the drawing. The toenail is darkened around the edges, and it seems like there's something hanging out of the nail. It makes the entire story so much grosser, seeing what this family is so excited and eager to eat. The illustration isn't essential to the story, but it does give the story so much more character. Another one of my personal favorite images comes from the 3rd book in the series, More Tales to Chill Your Bones. This story is called The Pale Lady, and it's about a ghostly woman who appears in a girl's dreams to warn her of danger. Okay, cool. It's the ghost of a lady who clearly wants to help out the main character. She seems to be warning of some kind of danger, so she must be pretty chill. So what does this benevolent spirit look like? Oh, it's a horrifying abomination that will haunt me for the rest of my life? Cool. This image is iconic and amazing. The dark, stringy hair that hangs over the woman's shoulders, the enlarged face with the tiny eyes and an uncannily large mouth that almost looks like it's been stitched together. This image was depicted in the movie adaptation of these books that came out a couple years ago, and the Pale Lady was probably my favorite part of that movie. Everything about this picture is just so unnerving and frightening. It's absolutely genius. But sadly, this video isn't just going to be me gushing over how amazing all these illustrations are. I could certainly fill an entire video with that, but I wanted to talk about the great tragedy of the 2011 republishing of this series. You see, these books, for the longest time, were kind of like some sort of forbidden text that every school library had. Some kids like myself would stumble onto them, and while the covers were certainly eerie, the images on the inside were much worse. And I think this caused the books to fly under the radar for a really long time, but then the internet happened and more people started talking about the things from their childhood that creeped them out, and these books were at the top of most of those lists. So, thinking that the allure of these books was solely the stories and not the images, the publisher commissioned an artist to redo all the drawings for a reprinting and to tone them down significantly from what they once were. Now, before we get into these drawings, I need to get this part out of the way. Brett Hellquist, the guy who did the new art for all these books, is a phenomenal artist. His drawings are great and are still done in that kind of pencil style that Gamble used. The actual images are professional and beautiful, but that's also kind of the problem. So when I'm talking about what I don't like about these new images, I'm not saying that Hellquist is a bad artist. I think he's a great artist, but his drawings were just toned down significantly from the original, and I think they're a lot worse in that regard. To get rid of the original art is to kind of get rid of the soul of the book. I think that Alvin Schwartz, the author, is a great writer, and these stories are fun and spooky, but the stories themselves are not enough to capture the minds and attention of young readers. It was the original art that got myself and many others interested in the book, just seeing these creepy illustrations. They gave the books their identities, and they drew the readers in and made them imagine what these horrifying drawings would look like in in real life. So to illustrate this point, let's compare images from the original book to the reprint. I have 3 images and their remakes, and we'll start with what I think is the best of the remakes and get to what I consider to be the worst of them. The first images come from the story Bloody Fingers, in which a hotel has a haunted room that the owner of the hotel tells people not to stay in. A man stays the night despite this and wakes up to a ghost with bloody fingers. He then freaks out and runs out of the hotel. The second night, the exact same thing happens, only this time it's a woman who stays in the hotel room. The ghost with the bloody fingers pops out and says, bloody fingers, and the woman flees in terror. A week later, a man arrives with a guitar and rents out the haunted hotel room yet again, knowing that it's haunted. The ghost pops out at night and says, bloody fingers, and the man, who's now playing his guitar, tells the ghost to cool it and get himself a band-aid, just completely unbothered. So this story is kind of creepy, but it also ends in a humorous way. Our original image for the story is this one. Again, the hand is dripping and the black blood looks stringy and strange. We see that the hand ends in a stump and that blood is pooling on the ground. The new image is also pretty good. We see 2 bloody, dripping hands, but the image just feels less violent and eerie to me. The hands look like they are connected to a body, which is more accurate to the story, but I think severely lowers the creep factor. Overall, this change isn't that drastic. I personally prefer the first image, but I wouldn't riot in the streets if it was replaced with the second. Let's look at another comparison of Gamel's original illustrations to Hellquist's newer ones. These images come from a kind of scary game that was included in the first collection of scary stories, and is something that you might have played before in the past. It's called Dead Man's Brains and involves a group of people sitting in a circle in a dark room. The storyteller passes around items that they claim are the remains of the victim of a murder. A wet, squishy tomato is supposed to be the brains, 2 peeled grapes are the eyes, a rubber glove filled with mud is his rotting hands, and so on and so forth. It's a fun, morbid game that you can use to gross your friends out. I remember doing this once when I was younger at a Halloween party, and it was an absolute nightmare because I hate touching anything squishy or wet. I can't even put lotion on my hands because it just gives me the ick. The original image for this page is this. It's a creepy old lady carrying a platter with the steaming head of a corpse that is cut open from the forehead up. It's really gross looking, but also kind of funny. I especially love the home sweet home sign in the back. It's a fun touch. This image works so well for me because it allows the mind of the reader to wander. The story itself is essentially just instructions for the game, but the image always made my mind create a narrative around this weird old lady. I would always imagine this woman cooking up this head like it was any other meal, and that would just upset me, like it was a weird, eerie touch on something that seems so normal. It very much reminds me out of something of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, only slightly less grimy and gross. The newer image is, yet again, really well drawn, but at least to me, is missing so much of the style that the original image has. We see the depiction of a hand reaching into a bowl that presumably has the gross items in it that the game talks about. It's a much more literal interpretation of what is happening on the page. I have to think that this was intentional on the publisher's part. They felt that the original drawings were both too scary and also sometimes only tangentially related to the story itself. I personally think that's a really big plus for the old drawings. There are certainly pictures that aren't really related to what is being said, or they kind of add a little bit to the story, but I think that makes these books so much more interesting because, again, it allows your mind to wander, it allows you to think about what is really going on and kind of create your own headcanon for it. I think it's a really useful tool for kids to imagine with. The newer drawings are depictions of what is actually being talked about on the page, which I don't think is a bad thing. Again, it's a fine drawing, but it doesn't really add anything to the story. And like I mentioned before, I think these stories are good, but I don't think they're anything mind-blowing, and without the original drawings, they kind of fall flat for me. And I guess I should say as well that I am an adult at this point, so maybe if I say these stories fall flat for me, maybe if I was a kid and I read them with these newer drawings, I would still be creeped out, but I really don't think that would be the case. Again, I barely remembered any of these stories, but I for sure remembered all of the horrifying images in them. The last comparison that I want to do is probably the most egregious one in my book. These drawings are found in the story Harold. This story is one of the most iconic in the series and one of my personal favorites, so I'm just going to do a full reading of this one. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool, green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months, then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, it was boring. All day the 2 men tended to their cows. At night they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. Everything remained the same until Thomas had an idea to make a human-sized scarecrow. Thomas commented on the joy of making it and putting it in the garden to scare the crows. When Alfred heard this, he decided to base the appearance of Harold. a farmer they both hated. They made a doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw and gave the Scarecrow Harold's characteristics along with naming it after him. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night, they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe that he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which both of them were sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you better eat it, or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," Thomas said, "and that will be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in the corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the doll grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then, one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We have been up here on this mountain for too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on his hind legs. All day and night he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told each other. "After all, what could a doll do?" They decided to draw straws to see which one would go back, and when they did, Thomas was the one to go back. After Thomas told Alfred that he would catch up with him, Alfred walked towards the valley. But when Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. This is such a good story. It's just like a fantastic little story about a scarecrow taking revenge, and it's definitely one that creeped me out when I first read it. The fact that the scarecrow essentially came to life because it was treated so poorly and then skinned and killed one of the farmers is really freaky. And to accompany this wonderful story, we have this iconic image, of course. I think this is a perfect drawing. The bloated, angry face, the belly hanging out, the uncomfortable position, and the weird strings coming off of him as well. It really builds the fear of seeing that thing at night when you would least expect it. This depiction was also used in the movie, and it was done really, really well. The scarecrow looks miserable. It's a little far-fetched to think that these two farmers could make something that looks like it's made out of human skin, but then you could also maybe theorize that this image isn't Harold, but the aftermath of Harold. Maybe that's what he turned this farmer into, that he killed and skinned. The remake of this image is pretty disappointing to me. Again, the drawing is well done, the art itself is great, but all the fear factor of the original is gone. Now he just looks like any other scarecrow walking on the roof. I don't find any menace in this version of a scarecrow coming after me, and even worse, I can't even imagine this thing killing and skinning someone. The original image looks like a monster out for revenge. This one just kind of looks like it's from The Wizard of Oz. Again, no shade to Hellquist. I think he is a great artist that was given an impossible task, but that brings up a point that I think is really important when it comes to children's horror. It's something that so many companies do, and it really bothers me. Kids like horror. They like to be scared. They like to feel like they're reading something that maybe they shouldn't be. They like to share these books with their friends and hide them from their parents. This is good. I think being scared as a kid is good. So often when publishers or authors or video game companies learn that their horror property is being enjoyed by children, they immediately tone down the horror. I hate when people do this because it completely ruins the allure of the media in the first place. The reason Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was so popular among young children like myself was because of these weird, creepy images. They scared me and my friends when we were younger. They push the boundary of what children could handle, and I think that's awesome. When you neuter the drawings and replace them with something more conventional and safe, you ruin the appeal of the books. Now it's just a collection of decent stories with some good drawings, but there isn't really anything special about it. This seriously happens all the time. Forgive me for talking about Five Nights at Freddy's, but in my opinion, it's one of the worst examples of this trope. The series started out as like a legitimately scary game about killer animatronics that hinted at child murder. The robots are literally stuffed with the corpses of dead children, and in the following games, we learned about a serial killer who was killing kids. That's so dark and messed up, and that's why kids were drawn to the series. I never really played the games. I watched all the game theories about the lore, but my younger brother, who was in late elementary school, maybe early middle school at the time, loved these games and he loved the lore of them. They felt like you were playing something that wasn't meant for you, and that's what made them so alluring. But then people realized that kids loved the series, and they slowly, over time, started catering the series to younger players. Now we have freaking Glam Rock Freddy. There is nothing scary or edgy about Glam Rock Freddy. I don't want this video to turn into me talking about FNAF because 20% of YouTube is channels talking about FNAF, but you guys get what I'm saying. Neutering children's horror because you think you know what kids want is lame. Let kids read books with creepy illustrations. Let them theorize about morbid things. There is nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. When you dumb down horror because you think you know what kids want, then you cheapen the entire genre as a whole. When the reprints of Scary Stories were released, they were met with some pretty significant backlash. Unfortunately, this led to some people insulting Brett Hellquist, who didn't do anything wrong. He was paid to make some drawings and he did a good job of that. But I think these reprints were met with so much criticism and ire because the original drawings are what made the books what they were. That's why I and so many other kids loved reading them. They introduced so many of us to horror, and now I literally spend my days making YouTube videos about horror because I love it so much. So that's really it. Don't dumb down horror because you think kids won't understand it or it'll be too much for them. They can handle it. And then when they're older, they'll think about all the creepy childhood trauma they remember from all these scary books, and they'll make videos about it, and everybody will talk about it, and it'll be a really, really good time. So if you're gonna read Scary Stories, read the original version. Those illustrations are amazing. If you are an elementary school teacher or librarian, leave those old ones up in your library or your classroom. Kids will enjoy it and it will not ruin their lives. Thank you guys so much for watching. Remember to please subscribe if you like what I do here. I talk about horror and disturbing books and creepypasta sometimes as well. I'm trying to hit 10,000 subs by the end of April is my new goal. I'm about halfway there right now and I think I can make it by then, but it'll definitely be a stretch. If you want to support me further, then please consider becoming a channel member where you will receive early access to all my videos, shoutouts on all my videos, and exclusive videos where I talk about some of my personal favorite books. There's a members only video up there right now where I talk about The Exorcist, Zodiac, and The Phantom Tollbooth. I want to shout out all of my channel members whose names you are seeing on the screen right now and give an extra thank you to my gold tier members, Amanda Mapes, Savish John, Lucas Fernando, Chris Lamb, Silent Trails, Blue Radio Media, and Ezra. Thank you guys so much. Your support really does mean the world to me. And I think that's going to be it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.